There are years we remember because something happened in them. And then there are years that seem to keep happening. More than 6 decades have passed since John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Yet 1963 has never settled completely into history. The event remains strangely alive, not only because questions surrounding the assassination persist, but because something about that moment still feels unfinished. Almost as if the country crossed a threshold without fully understanding what had been left behind. I have been thinking about this less as a political question than as a question about time. What if certain historical events are so consequential that they do not end when the calendar moves forward? What if they create fractures, places where one possible future closes and another begins? And what if, many years later, a civilization can find itself returning to the same unresolved point? Perhaps 1963 never really ended. It is easy to romanticize the past, and I do not want to do that. America in the early 1960s was hardly a lost paradise. There was racial injustice, Cold War fear, political corruption, and enormous inequality of power. But something else existed alongside those realities: a strong cultural belief in possibility. We were going to the moon. Science and medicine were advancing. Nuclear power promised energy abundance. The middle class was expanding. Whatever the limitations of the era, tomorrow was expected to contain things not yet imaginable. The future once felt like a place we were going. Now it often feels like something being done to us. We live surrounded by astonishing technology, yet much of the language of the future has become the language of limits. Scarcity, surveillance, managed expectations, rising costs, shrinking privacy, and adaptation to systems ordinary people have little power to influence. Technological possibility has expanded, while the felt horizon of human possibility has contracted. Somewhere between those two cultural states sits 1963. History becomes deceptive when viewed backward. Because something happened, we begin to assume that it had to happen. Kennedy was assassinated. Johnson became president. Vietnam escalated. The 1960s fractured. Watergate followed. Institutional trust deteriorated. The national security apparatus accumulated power. Looking backward, the sequence feels almost solid, as though the path beneath our feet had always existed. But from inside November 1963, none of that had happened yet. The future remained open. Wars had not expanded. Decisions had not been made. Technologies had not been pursued or abandoned. Institutions had not accumulated all the power they would later possess. Millions of lives still waited on choices that had not occurred. Before history becomes history, it is possibility. Every one of us carries versions of a life that never happened. The city we almost moved to. The work we nearly pursued. The person we might have become had one decision gone differently. Sometimes we can still feel those unrealized lives, not exactly as regret or fantasy, but as the faint presence of another path running beside the one we took. Civilizations may carry something similar. Futures can become inaccessible because of war, assassination, economic collapse, technological choices, or decisions made by people holding power at a particular moment. History closes a path, and once enough time passes, we forget there was ever another direction available. We begin mistaking the world that happened for the only world that could have happened. We already understand that unresolved experiences can repeat themselves in individual lives. Something happens that we cannot fully integrate, so we push it away. Years pass. Then, under different circumstances, we confront the same emotional structure again. Different people, different setting, same underlying wound. What has not been integrated has a strange way of returning. Why should civilizations be entirely different? Perhaps nations also carry unresolved events. Assassinations, wars, institutional betrayals, hidden programs, and official stories that never completely satisfy the people living beneath them. The machinery of government continues. Elections are held, children grow up, new buildings rise. Yet somewhere underneath ordinary life, the unresolved event remains active. That does not require every suspicion surrounding an event to be true. Something can remain unresolved because a substantial portion of the population never completely trusted what it was told. America did not simply lose a president in 1963. It may have begun losing confidence that the visible story and the actual story were necessarily the same thing. Once that fracture appears, it is difficult to repair. Vietnam deepened it. Watergate deepened it. Revelations about intelligence operations, war, surveillance, and financial crises deepened it. Different events and different decades kept returning the country to one underlying question. Are we being told what is actually happening? Perhaps that question is one of the deepest inheritances of 1963. We imagine time as a line, with the past behind us and the future ahead. Human experience rarely behaves so neatly. A photograph can resurrect someone long dead. An old symbol can return and suddenly carry enormous power. The future enters the present as well. Governments act according to forecasts. Markets move according to expectations. People reorganize their lives around outcomes that have not happened. Whoever shapes those stories possesses extraordinary power. Tell people that one future is inevitable, and they may organize the present around producing it. Tell them another future is impossible, and they may never attempt to build it. A future can be constrained long before it arrives through expectation, imagination, and the boundaries placed around what a culture is permitted to consider possible. Governments participate in creating those boundaries. So do corporations, universities, media, financial systems, technology companies, algorithms, experts, and markets. Every civilization builds an invisible fence around the imaginable. This technology is realistic. That one is fantasy. This economic structure is permanent. That alternative is naive. This war is unavoidable. That peace is impossible. Eventually, what is permitted to be imagined becomes confused with what is actually possible. This is where Donald Trump enters the story, not simply as a politician, but as a symbol within this historical moment. Whatever anyone believes about him, his language repeatedly reaches backward while insisting that something different lies ahead. Returning, restoring, rebuilding, recovering, taking back. He evokes the founders, industrial America, Kennedy, national confidence, and a country diverted from what it might have become. At the same time, the imagery surrounding him points toward artificial intelligence, space, advanced energy, and technological acceleration. The combination is neither simple nostalgia nor simple futurism. It suggests that something abandoned in the past must be recovered before another future can become possible. I am not claiming to know precisely what Trump intends with every phrase or reference, but symbols can express something larger than the conscious intentions of the people using them. Past, rupture, present, and imagined future have begun occupying the same cultural frame. That does not mean we should return to 1963. There were injustices and forms of blindness in that era that should never be romanticized. But certain qualities of the future imagined then may deserve another look. Energy abundance rather than perpetual scarcity. Technology that materially improves ordinary life. Scientific discovery not organized primarily around surveillance or behavioral control. A stable middle class capable of believing its children will have more opportunities. Communities that still belong to the people living inside them. Perhaps what was interrupted was not a specific Kennedy policy program. We cannot know what his unfinished presidency would have become. Perhaps something more subtle was lost: confidence in possibility itself. That may be why Kennedy remains so culturally alive. He became connected not only to the life he lived, but to everything that might have happened had he lived. The president who never grew old. The administration that never completed itself. The decisions that were never made. The future that can never be tested against reality because it never happened. Kennedy became inseparable from an unrealized future. Maybe 1963 was less an answer than a question America has never fully answered. Who actually holds power? What should the relationship between secrecy and democracy be? When does national security become institutional self-preservation? Who decides when wars begin, which technologies are developed, and what version of history becomes official? What happens when people no longer trust their institutions to tell the truth? Those are not old questions. They are among the defining questions of the present. We now inhabit a world 1963 could barely have imagined. Artificial intelligence can create convincing events that never occurred. Algorithms determine which portions of reality billions of people encounter. Corporations possess extraordinary amounts of behavioral information. Propaganda no longer has to arrive as the same newspaper headline or television broadcast delivered to everyone. It can arrive individually, personally, and algorithmically. Reality itself has become contested territory. Once people stop trusting a common story, they begin searching for alternatives. Those alternatives multiply until every institution, faction, and movement possesses its own map of reality. We no longer argue only about what an event means. We argue about whether it happened, whether the evidence is authentic, whether the image is real, whether the voice belongs to the person speaking, and whether the authority reporting it has an agenda. That can become dangerous, but it may also force us to ask a question we should have been asking all along. What can I actually verify? History may not offer literal second chances. Kennedy will not walk out of Dealey Plaza. The decisions of the 20th century cannot be undone, and the people lost to them cannot be restored. But perhaps the questions beneath history can return. Perhaps possibilities can reopen in different forms. Perhaps something abandoned can be reconsidered without recreating the world in which it originally appeared. We do not need another 1960s. We may need to ask what became impossible afterward, and whether it was ever truly impossible at all. Perhaps that is why we seem surrounded by ghosts. Kennedy, the Cold War, nuclear power, the space race, industrial America, intelligence agencies, government secrecy, and old arguments about sovereignty. People even feel nostalgia for periods they never personally experienced. We usually dismiss nostalgia as sentimentality, but perhaps nostalgia can sometimes contain information, not a desire to return, but the recognition that something disappeared. The task would not be to recreate the world that existed before the loss. It would be to identify the abandoned possibility hidden inside it. And so I return to the question with which I began. What if 1963 never really ended? What if certain moments remain active because the questions embedded within them were never answered? What if a civilization can spend 60 years moving away from a rupture, only to discover that the road eventually curves back toward it? Maybe that is where we are now, not returning to Dealey Plaza, but returning to the questions that survived it. Who governs? Who tells the truth? Who decides which futures are possible? Who benefits when people believe there is no alternative? What happens when institutional stories stop matching lived reality? And perhaps most importantly, what future would we choose if we stopped assuming the one we inherited was inevitable?